Well, I said I would do it, and here we are. My review from reading the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft last year. Let's get started. Now, I have this monster, the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, and I enjoyed reading it. It took me 2 months and change to get through the whole thing, and that kinda slowed me off my pace I was on to maybe get more books read last year. But this is a lot. It's a lot, and it is, not the huge text you might expect from a book this size. Not including this weird little timeline they threw in at the end. 1,094 pages. It's almost 1,100 pages on this guy. What I enjoy a lot about Lovecraft's writing is when he's most on his game, there's this sense that he takes, and I'm going to borrow from Orson Scott Card's essay on the nature of horror. He takes this format that is typically dread, terror, horror, right? Dread is the buildup of tension. It's the turning of the, imagine you have a rubber band and you're just twisting a pencil between them, and there's like this buildup and buildup and buildup and buildup. And terror is the snap. Terror is the release of energy. Horror is the gory aftermath, right? So in a well-written story of the horror genre, you're looking for a story that's like inciting incident, dread, 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 terror, terror, horror. Like that's the format you really want to be seeing in something like this. And what Lovecraft has done, because horror really is the low point of a horror genre story. It's, dread is Freddy Krueger's gonna stab you. Terror is you got stabbed. Horror is, oh look, a stabbed body. Horror is the least viscerally engaging of the three. But what Lovecraft does and what I really enjoy in his writing is when he is most on his game and when he is really just nailing it and showing what the genre can do, he takes that 3-part formula and twists it into something almost like The Promise, The Turn, and The Prestige, right? The horror in Lovecraft is not the body. Like, take a story like Cold Air, and by the way, I should say, I try to avoid spoilers most of the time when I review stuff. This will be a spoiler-heavy review. Spoiler-heavy. So you take a story like Cold Air. You have the premise of guy moves in downstairs from this dude who keeps his apartment really, really, really cold, but is also some kind of doctor, I guess? Cool, good premise. The dread is something's up with this dude. Something's not right. Something's messed up. Something's twisted. The terror is that final day, as he is frantically trying to send ice back, and you can tell something is gone horribly wrong. And the horror, on the surface of it, the horror is, oh, the guy's dead. Look at this weird melted body, this, gross mass that used to be a human. But the real horror that comes through, and it comes through at the same time, in the same moment, following the same story beats, and that's what makes it so effective. The horror in Lovecraft is the implication of the terror. It's the reveal of, oh, that's what was really going on this whole time. So the implication of Cold Air is he finds this melted weird body and then finds the letter, right? And the letter shouldn't be the horrific part of this, but the letter is what reveals this has been an artificially animated corpse, right, for years. This man was touched by a living corpse. He had his wounds treated by this weird living corpse, right? And that's the format that you see, is that the horror element, when it shows up, does something to elevate the story and reveal something about the story that makes you go, oh. Right, and that's where he really takes it into something so much better. So, what I'm going to do with this, I want to talk a little bit more about Lovecraft, but in general, most of this is going to come down to a top 10, my favorite stories of Lovecraft, top 10. What are some of the themes we see in Lovecraft? There's the sea, there's archaeology, there's the world of dreams, right? He has an entire set of stories that get subdivided as the dream cycle. And that has to deal with Randolph Carter, the Silver Key, Kadath, all that stuff. There's the unknown, right? And that's going to come up to some extent in most horror, but he uses it very, very well. There's ancient aliens. There's Clarke's third law. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That, Clarke wrote after Lovecraft. I think Clarke was in the 50s or 60s. Lovecraft was in the 20s. But you see that come through, this idea that the science of an alien mind looks like magic and looks like sorcery. And if these ancient aliens have been on Earth this whole time, then their science was the basis of our species' magic and mysticism and all of that. And it comes together really, really interestingly, right? First thing you see in the story collection is Beast in the Cave, and I believe this is a chronological collection. So that would make Beast in the Cave Lovecraft's first published story. And it already, you can see where just the kernel of what his style is already there. There's a few early on that do feel like Lovecraft's getting away from his strengths. When Lovecraft is doing what he does best, it's amazing. When he's not doing what he does best, he writes something like Sweet Ermengarde. That was the standout weirdest one. There were a few others that were kind of slice-of-life-y and based very heavily on coincidence. Sweet Ermengarde felt like he wanted to try and write like O. Henry for a story. And yeah, imagine any horror writer trying to do their best O. Henry impression. You have an idea of what Sweet Ermengarde is like. Overall, great collection. I'm glad I've read the complete fiction. There's some I might skip on a reread, honestly. Mostly Sweet Ermengarde. There were a few others, like I said, that kind of went into that weird slice of life thing, but I just could not wrap my head around what was going on in that one. Also, if you're ever going to read Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, I suggest you basically pick up this book and read it where it turns up in the collection, because Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is his Avengers. It brings in the Cats of Ulthar. It brings in, I think, Cellophase is how it's pronounced. It brings in a lot to do with Randolph Carter, the Silver Key. It brings in Pikmins Model. Pikmins Model somehow intersects the world of dreams. I don't get it, but it's in there, right? And so Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath should be read in context of the rest of Lovecraft. Anything else of his, read it. It's great. That one draws from so much that he's already established in his own lore. I don't think it would hit as well if you haven't read pretty much everything that came before it. That said, that was everything I wanted to say before getting to my top 10. H.P. Lovecraft's top 10. Number 10, The Music of Erich Zahn. This one had a tremendous atmosphere. Essentially, a man moves into an apartment complex, and one of his upstairs neighbors is heard playing the violin at night, and there's a strange alien quality to the violin music. And the man tries to draw close to this Erich Zahn who lives near him, and eventually you get this reveal of the window in Erich Zahn's room letting out onto these unknown vistas, and I think it's entirely possible that his violin was joining the mad piping that keeps the demon Sultan Azathoth asleep within the mythos. And so, that's my theory. Who knows? But it's so very, very good. Number 9, At the Mountains of Madness. Most people would probably put this one higher. It is one of Lovecraft's best remembered stories. There are just some of his that I absolutely love that had to edge this one a lot further down the list than I think most people would put it. At the Mountains of Madness is an Antarctic expedition, and I believe it's the germinating seed for what came with the movie The Thing. Even back to the earliest version of The Thing, that's still a more recent story than At the Mountains of Madness. And At the Mountains of Madness is, they go on this research expedition, they find this alien life form there. Unlike The Thing, they find that this is its home. At the extreme inaccessibility of the South Pole, there is this city, right? And it's where these elder things lived and grew and had their society. And you see at the end this thing called a Shoggoth. And Shoggoths come up a lot in Lovecraft, and they are sort of this manifestation of the madness that men find when they look too deeply into the unknown. And they're this shape-shifting servitor that was built by the Elder Things. And so it's this like bubbling mass of just forming, popping, reforming physical features. And so you can see where a lot of that would influence the Thing. At least I assume you can see where those connections draw together. Number 8, the color out of space. So this guy goes out and they're talking about making a reservoir in this farmland, or not even farmland, this forest land. And he's told the story of what happened on one of the farms there, that this meteor came out of space and things started to change and mutate and warp, and it became this horrifying thing. And at the end, you're not 100% sure whether this was like an alien intelligence that came down, or whether this was the 1920s concept of what interacting with radiation might do to a person, right? You don't even really know how much is these people going mad from being exposed to this whatever it is. And that uncertainty is so good for me. I love when it hits that kind of spot in a story. Number 7, Cool Air, which I've already described in pretty thorough detail, but it was just such a great explanation and demonstration of Lovecraft's ability to elevate the dread terror horror cycle into something a lot like the Promised Turn in Prestige. He was essentially a scientific lich, is the best way to put it. He used science and chemistry and biology and made himself a lich, a living corpse, a corpse with a living consciousness inside of it. Number 6, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. I personally am surprised I put this one so far down. When I went into this, before I started reading this, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward was my favorite H.P. Lovecraft story, and I had read a lot of what's in here already. Probably more than half, if I had to guess. And The Case of Charles Dexter Ward is so good. I do think on rereading it drags a little bit more than I remember, but to set the scene, this young man finds out about one of his ancestors who, if you're at all familiar with the old Roman practice of damnatio, like history tried to expunge the fact that this man ever existed. Unmarked grave, name stricken out of records, everything. And as that intrigues this young scholastic man, he tries to find it. And I can't even go into all the twists that take place. Essentially, at the end, it's revealed that he discovered this ancestor's science to such an extent that he brought this ancestor back. And this ancestor masqueraded as him for a time. And it's one of those that does bear rereading, right? Because when you know where the replacement takes place, you can then go back and be like, oh, that's why all of these inexplicable things were happening in this order. Bah! I do still love this one. It is still among my favorites. There were just a few that I had to bump up a hair more. And we'll go right into those, starting with number 5, The Whisperer in the Darkness. Part of why I love this one is I really want to get a game of Ex Profundis going, and that seems very much based on The Whisperer in the Darkness. The first half of the story is epistolary, by which I mean it's told via letters, right? And what's really interesting is you get this one guy who is sharing his letters, the letters he received, and then bemoaning the fact that he didn't save all the letters. You get these interludes in between the letters that make it feel more real than most epistolary novels actually do. From the epistolary, it then moves to him going out and finding this guy and discovering that all of this madness about being visited and harassed by creatures from other planets was true. And it becomes a body horror thing, and it's so good. So good. I really like this one a lot. Number 4, The Temple. This one is very different in tone and style. Like, you can tell it's one of his earlier ones before he really found his groove, but he hit a very good groove with this one, despite it not being where his style would eventually land long term. In The Temple, it's the story of a German U-boat that finds this idol in some wreckage, and it starts driving them mad, and it's told from the captain's perspective as he is, like, in order to maintain any kind of control, executing more and more of the crew, and thinking he's the sane one the entire time. It's just such a mind trip to watch his descent into madness. And it finally leads to him suiting up, leaving the ship, and just walking out across the ocean in search of what this idol is now calling him to. It's amazing. Number 3, Pikmins Model. I knew going into this that Pikmins Model would be high on my list. It is so good. Here's where Pikmins Model starts off. You know from the way the narrator describes it that Pikmin has fallen out of favor with the fashionably macabre, artistic subculture in the city. And I do actually, this is a good moment to talk about what Lovecraft does really well as well with building up the dread. He has these stories told by a narrator in the past tense. So the narrator is a part of events. They are telling these stories that have already happened to them. And what that does is you get these interludes right at the beginning of, I have nothing to do with Pikmin anymore. No, you don't understand what kind of man he is. And then you get the whole story of what kind of person Pikmin is. It builds dread so well, but so realistically, right? And so with Pikmin's Model, you see just this man descending and seeing in this guy's basement how degraded and horrifying his art has become. And even that doesn't dissuade him, right? He's seeing these weird demonic paintings, and he hears this weird shuffling from the next room. He goes to the next room, he's looking around, he sees all this stuff, and he knocks a cover off one of the paintings in progress, and that's where he sees the thing that absolutely terrifies him, because all these pictures of like weird demons and ghouls and all this stuff, he assumed they were the product of this demented mind, and finally, there at the end, what he sees is a photograph of one of these creatures. And it is so good. I told you there'd be spoilers. Yeah. Number 2, The Shadow Out of Time. This one is such a great examination of how time travel could work in a storytelling setting. It's also just a great way of depicting these aliens that are so much more than us, but still of a limited material, mortal frame, right? And it's this man who loses, I think, like 3 years of his life, and just wakes up not knowing where he is and being told that for the last 3 years he had been like a severe case of amnesia, he'd forgotten who he was, and then he starts having these weird dreams. And those weird dreams lead him to exploring the Australian outback, and there he finds this city he's been dreaming about, right? And it's this reveal of the reason that for 3 years you had amnesia, there was an alien in your head, and your mind was in an alien's head. And it had reached across time. His mind had been pulled back through the ages, and an alien's mind had come forward through the ages to study humanity. And he had been this prisoner of this alien society waiting for his body back. And the way that it's handled and the way that all of that reveal comes out is fantastic. Number 1, my favorite, as of this rereading, H.P. Lovecraft story, The Thing on the Doorstep. This one is dark. It's uncomfortable. The horror violates bodily autonomy in a way that is disturbing, fundamentally. And what it is this mind that has mastered something akin to hypnosis to the point that it can body swap, right? And so you see this guy who's worried about his friend, as his friend has entered this relationship with this woman. And it turns out this woman, the mind in her head was her father's mind. He took over her body and then set out to look for another body. And, you know, the father was this, like, he was very sexist. He wanted to find a male body to channel his power through. And the way it comes about and the way the fear builds and the way that you see this man who is terrified, right, of going home to his wife. He's terrified of the places he's woken up when he comes back to his senses in his own body. It's one of the other stories that references Shoggoths. He's descended steps and seen these horrors beneath the earth that he never wanted to go towards. And it's the one story, I think, where you don't see a person whose curiosity led them to destroy themselves, which is the hubris that you see in most of Lovecraft. And I think the reason this stands out, like, that is a good feature of Lovecraft. This stands out from the rest of Lovecraft because it doesn't do that. This one story shows someone who is completely victimized by these horrors that mankind was never meant to know, and yet he's brought face to face with them against his will. And it makes the horror more tangible. It makes this story so... I want to say dark. I can't think of another word for it. It is such an interesting headspace to try and, like, there is no escape from the trap he's found himself in. And it is horror writing at its best. So, that is my top 10 of the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. This one's probably going to be a longer video looking at the runtime so far, even before I've edited it. Probably going to be a longer video. Someone thinks he's funny. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, you can, all the stuff YouTubers always say, like, comment, and subscribe. More than any of that, you can tell a friend. All of that said, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Later, y'all. Thank you for watching. Please share the video with a friend or several friends, and let me know in the comments if there's anything you'd like to see me draw in a future video. Later, y'all.